Our next talk is by Dr. Stephen Schuetz. He tells me it rhymes with toots. Dr. Schuetz is initially did his training all up at Northwestern Chicago, and came down to Ochsner after his residency for a fellowship in colorectal surgery, and also has a degree in genetics out in the West Coast, California. And then he is currently a colorectal surgeon, but also interestingly is a lead of global oncology, where he actually spends the majority of his year in Bolivia doing surgical oncology, really with global efforts. So he touches our patients locally and abroad, and we have the pleasure of hearing from him talking about updates in hereditary GI cancer syndromes.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Mizrahi, for the opportunity to speak today. I do not have any financial disclosures for this. Very brief outline, because there's a lot to cover. Hereditary GI cancers. We had a whole conference, 3.5 days in Philly in November about this. And then there's a whole hereditary cancer for gastric cancers that happened in Portugal, which we'll mention briefly. But trying to fit all this in about 25 minutes is hard to do. So we'll touch very, very briefly on updates in hereditary cancers in the last year is really the focus of this talk, but some background for individuals who aren't very involved in this area. So just to make sure we're all starting from the same point, this is a nice study that came out not within the last year, but in 2021 from JAM Oncology from Mayo, looked at their experience of doing universal tumor testing for all solid tumors compared to a targeted testing. And so they had about 3,000 patients that total in their final series. And see if I can keep on progressing. Okay, I don't know if this died or... I'm not getting any response from any. No, I'm trying every button to advance. We'll see if there's any. Well, I'll keep on talking, but yeah, I'm trying the keyboard too, which won't advance either. Here, let me see if I can use the mouse. All right, I'll just use the mouse for it. Oh, there we go. Now we're back. So 3,000 patients total. These were unselected, so did not select them based off of family history, specific tumor characteristics, no other risk factors. They did the Invitae 84 gene panel, and they identified a pathogenic variant in 13.3% of individuals. When you break this down further, you can see that about 9.5 total had moderate or high-risk gene mutations. This is across all solid tumors without any selection. And out of those, only about 50% actually met NCCN criteria for testing, which is one of the big arguments for universal testing. And 6.4% of the patients total had incremental changes and findings in their gene testing that ultimately changed their care. We do know that 48% of individuals who undergo large panels will have a variant of uncertain significance, which is sort of that one of the arguments against doing universal testing, just because of what does that mean, what stress does that cause for the patients. But if you start to break down some of their data a little bit more, this is switching from a Mac to a PC. But those are your GI cancers in the red box. If this image had not flipped, you would see that with colorectal cancer, there's a positivity rate unselected of 15.3%. Let me see it on my version here. For pancreatic is the next one, which is your 15.9%. Biliary is 14.5%. And then esophageal and gastric drops down to, or is around 14.9%. But if you select out the autosomal recessive genes, the genes that really don't impact care, low penetrance genes, then those numbers will drop down. And these are really the actionable genes that we find. So again, on the top of that box is colorectal cancer at 11.3% of genes will come back with a moderate or high penetrance mutation. Pancreatic at 13.6% and 14.5%, again, similar for hepatobiliary. So that is really what we're starting at. Those are our rates if we know that we're doing universal testing across the board without selecting patients. The other thing, since a lot of people don't work within this realm, there are NCCN guidelines which are continually updated about 3 or 4 times a year. The most recent updates you can see, again, within the last year, NCCN has expanded their guidelines from colorectal alone to colorectal, endometrial, and gastric cancer, which we'll mention a little bit, the gastric aspect. And then breast, ovarian, pancreatic is now BOP with 2 Ps. The prostate was always a part of it, but now is more of just a titular change than anything. But those are the big things that we think about within the hereditary GI cancer world for these guidelines. So thinking through some of the major changes that have happened within 2024, well, now there's a whole section on diffuse hereditary gastric cancer testing management, which has not existed before from the NCCN. You also have the endometrial gastric to refer to, and they built out their polyposis syndrome guidelines a little bit more. So jumping into our cancer-specific guidelines, we know that anywhere from 8 to 16% of colorectal cancers will have a pathogenic variant, depending on how you define the variants that you're looking for, as well as your patient population. There's a study from Laura Valle out in the Barcelona group that sort of splits up how we think through hereditary cancers. You have your non-polyposis and your polyposis syndrome. So we all know Lynch is the primary driver of our hereditary colorectal cancer syndromes with about 8% prevalence. In this group, this was looking at young onset cancer, so anybody under the age of 50, they had an 11% positivity rate, which is why we now recommend universal germline testing for anybody 50 and under with colorectal cancer or really any Lynch syndrome because of this 8% positivity rate. Then you get into your polyposes, which again, NCCN does a little bit better job now breaking down more clearly, but we know that FAP is a leading driver there with an APC mutation found in 1.1% of these individuals under the age of 50. And then you can get in, depending on the pathology of your polyps, for hamartomatous polyps, serrated polyps, or mixed polyposis syndromes, your difference. We do know that there are additional genes, so Laura published this in 2021 as a review, but since there's AXIN2 biallelic, that should be MLH3, MSH3, MBD4, and other genes that are continually being found with increasing mosaicism, that now we're doing more testing on the polyps alone if patients come back with negative germline testing but have evidence of a polyposis syndrome. There's evidence that there is mosaicism that will occur where people will just have APC mutations in their upper GI tract or in their colon. So again, just guidelines to refer to with significant changes. You can see all of the additional genes that are more and more being recognized with your POL-E, POL-D1. But one of the biggest updates in the last year, that unless you are really reviewing the day-to-day changes of these guidelines, is that CHEK2 has been downgraded. So this is a significant change because CHEK2 was previously considered to have a 5 to 10% colorectal cancer risk, which is similar to the rate of colorectal cancer in individuals with a first-degree relative. So those are patients that we screen every 5 years for colorectal cancer, which was the prior recommendation. Those individuals have now been determined to be at general population rate, and there's no longer screening indicated for them unless they have a specific family history of colorectal cancer. So that's a big change in the most recent guidelines. That's coming from this paper in Cancer Genetics. It was actually the end of 2023, but it was Myriad looked at all of their patients with a CHEK2 mutation, looked at it across truncating, missense, and different prevalent mutations that are in our population, and showed that the rates of non-polyposis colorectal cancer are identical across the board, as well as individuals with a family history of colorectal cancer do not differ if you have a CHEK2 mutation or you don't, and it does not depend on what type of mutation you have. So again, you can see the forest plot here, everything's overlapping, everything's crossing one, there's no difference here. And so CHEK2 has been taken out of our colorectal cancer risk, which will change our screening guidelines for these patients. The other thing, this is a publication by Sudeep Banerjee, he published this while he was a fellow at Cleveland, looking at all of their FAP patients. And so this is another nice paper that came out last year. They had 197 patients that had surgery, and this is during the iliopouch anal anastomosis years, so really beginning in 1993 up until 2020. And they evaluated patients to see how are our criteria for selecting patients for rectal preservation or not held up over the last 27 years. So they had 197 total patients with FAP, and 8% subsequently underwent completion proctectomy. So that's the big question, is if we save your rectum, which has significant benefits for quality of life, sexual function, fecundity for women who want to get pregnant, what's the chance that we're going to have to ultimately go back and take that out later? Is it better if we just do a pouch? And traditionally, the original publication from 2001 in New England Journal really showed 20 polyps or more as an indication to take out the rectum, and if you have less than 20 polyps and an APC mutation, then you can clear the rectum endoscopically and preserve that organ for quality of life. But they looked and they showed that for individuals with 20 or more, they had a 26%, so 1 in 4 had to have their rectum removed, which is a high number, but still not mandatory compared to only 6%. So that number still holds up. The Italian literature out of Milan goes up to 30 polyps, so it really depends on your endoscopist how comfortable you are removing all those polyps and the pathology that comes out if you have high-grade dysplasia. or have a polyp burn that you can't manage. That was about 50% of the indication for removing the rectum in this in the single center series. So just keep moving for the sake of time. Pancreatic cancer syndromes. Pancreatic cancer, we know, is universal testing now, so anybody with pancreatic cancer should have germline testing done. We know that the rate is 13% in the MD Anderson study, or in the, Mayo Clinic study, but will go up to 15, 16% depending on what group you look at. Memorial has, with their MS Impact data, they have a higher percentage of patients with a mutation, but we know that the majority are in ATM, your BRCAs, and Lynch as well. And because of this, universal testing is now recommended. This is not a new update, but just something to make sure that we are reinforcing for anybody with pancreatic cancer and all first-degree relatives. So pancreatic cancer has very poor 5-year survival, so people who have a family history, they don't have their relative living anymore, all of their first-degree relatives would be indicated to undergo testing, and that testing is indicated by the NCCN and covered by insurance. But we know that because family history is not predictive of who has a germline mutation or not. So we don't have good ways of selecting for those patients with a high prevalence of pathogenic variants. And so because of that, universal testing is recommended. One of the big updates in the last year, actually in the last few months, is we previously would recommend universal pancreatic cancer surveillance in individuals with Buerger's and CDKN2A, your familial atypical mole melanoma syndrome. And all of your other genes were only, surveillance was only indicated if you had a family history in first or second degree relatives. But in the most recent updated, well, we now have version 3.2025, but we have broken out ATM and BRCA2 mutations, so now it is universal surveillance is recommended in all of those patients, which means starting at age 50, regardless of family history, everybody should be starting with alternating EUS and MRCP as sort of the traditional. But we know with the number of patients that have ATMs and BRCA2 mutations, that will quickly overwhelm our endoscopy availability to perform EUSs. So at Ochsner, we're hiring 2 new advanced endoscopists who will be able to help meet this demand. But UCSF, for instance, they're starting to switch over to just MRCP alone. We know that there are pros and cons of each, which is a little bit more in depth than we're going to get into in this talk, but something that we should be calling back these patients who have been previously diagnosed and told that they don't need pancreatic cancer screening because they don't have a family history. Well, now universal screening is going to be indicated. We know this was not off of a new publication that came out, but the CAPS group out of Hopkins, and now the CAPS 5 study has come out in the last 2 years. But the CAPS consortium really defines a 5% lifetime risk or a 5 times relative risk as being the threshold for considering screening for pancreatic cancer. And this is also accepted by the ASGE in their most recent guidelines from 2021-2022. But this is data from the CAPS consortium, or actually, sorry, this is from Mayo with Dr. Couch from 2018, so a little bit older data, but shows that if you look at the relative rate, so this is a case control study, they compared all of their patients for individuals with these pathogenic variants to the genome or the NOMAD genomic database to see what their cancer relative risk is. And you can see that for BRCA2 and ATM, their risk gets above that 5 times relative risk threshold. And so because of that, with these thresholds in place, we're now screening for those patients. If you look at TP53, MLH1, and BRCA1, while TP53 and MLH1 for Leaf, Romani, and Lynch do have a higher than 5 times relative risk, their overall 95% confidence interval is so wide that the data is just not as reliable. And you can see it drops as low as 1.1 to 2 times relative risk. So for those mutations, we're still recommending only screening in individuals who have a family history in first or second degree relatives. This is a paper that came out in the last year. This is from the CAPS consortium showing that the patients that they detected cancer within the 13 institutions that are participating in the consortium, led by Hopkins, they can show the significant downstaging in individuals. So you can see how many more patients in the dark blue bar from the CAPS consortium who were screened versus matched controls in the SEER database in the 2 following columns. You can see the differences in staging, and you can see ultimate overall survival difference between these 2 patient populations. So really demonstrating that, yes, there is an indication, there is a benefit for these patients to screen. Very briefly, pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer syndromes, we generally think about 4 typical syndromes. for pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. This is a study published last year between Anderson and Hopkins that compared a Anderson cohort of selected patients over 6 years based off of specific criteria of young age, family, personal history, or syndromic features versus the Hopkins unselected cohort, again, trying to understand what is the true prevalence of mutations in these patients, thought to be around 8 to 10% based off of historic data. And you can see, again, a lot of the distribution of the mutations that we find in our selected cohort with a 33%, so 1 in 3 patients in the selected cohort had a mutation. And if you look at the Hopkins unselected cohort, it was 22%. So that's a very high number to say, well, 1 in 5 patients will have a mutation. But as again, you start to get down into the data, you can see that a lot of these mutations were autosomal recessive or mutations that we would not consider actionable. So because the Anderson group selected more highly, there's not a significant change, drops from 33 to 32%. But the Hopkins group that was unselected, once you remove people who have clearly clinical evidence of MEN1 or have mosaic variants or autosomal recessive conditions, that drops from 22% to really 10%. So 1 in 10 individuals unselected will have, who don't have other clinical criteria, will have positive mutations. But that raises the question, what is our threshold to test? And this is a whole debate. Anderson has a conference next week that they're going to debate this as well. Should we be doing universal testing? And when we try to come up with a threshold, what is the pre-test probability that we would need in order to recommend genetic testing for a patient? Well, if you look at the colorectal data coming out of Dana-Farber with the PREM and other calculators, anybody with a 5% risk of having Lynch syndrome or higher should get tested. And Farber has some data even showing that that could be as low as 2.5% for unaffected individuals because there's a higher possibility of detecting them based off of the calculators. The same holds true in breast. For breast cancer, it's recommended anybody with a 5% risk based off of any of your risk calculators of having a mutation should undergo testing, including is consideration down to 2.5, and same for ovarian. So really 5% risk, 1 in 20 patients, or 1 in 20 probability number needed to treat of 20 would be our indicator. And if we look at that, oh, well, this is going to screw me again, but this is our, so if it wasn't flipped, you'd be able to see, this is diving into that Mayo Clinic data a little bit more, and you can see the cancer type. So if you actually look at the high-risk mutations, so if we're only considering BRCA1 and 2 or Lynch, you can see the percent prevalence found in this universal testing strategy. And then if you consider all high-risk, high-penetrance genes, which would include Li-Frau-Many, which would include APC and other significant syndromes, all of those cancers are over 5% risk. And so that sort of gets into that discussion of should we be testing more patients? And I think we're moving into more and more universal testing across different cancers. You can see how they compare with breast and ovarian. Very quickly, in my last 5 minutes, updates for CDH1, hereditary diffuse gastric cancer that came out in the last year. So a study published in JAMA back in September by Jeremy Davis's group out at the NCI. This looked at 4 different institutions around the country of Farber, NCI, University of Chicago, and Stanford, and had combined all of their kindreds or all of their families who had hereditary diffuse gastric cancer with a CDH1 mutation, and made sure that there wasn't overlap, but you can start to see 213 different families in North America. So this is really trying to define what is the risk of gastric cancer for a CDH1 mutation in North America. They had over 7,000 patients that were included, family members in the analysis, majority white, and you can look at individuals who had different cancers. So out of their cohort, you can see that about 50% of patients had both breast and gastric, and then the other 50% had a somewhat equal split between individuals, families with only breast cancer in the families and families with only gastric cancers in the families, as we know that those are 2 different syndromes that really show themselves in our family histories. On average, 6 individuals underwent germline testing in each family, and you can see the number of individuals with CDH1 mutations with a slight prevalence towards female patients. And then again, our gastric cancer distribution with an average onset age of advanced gastric cancer of 49. But the interesting part of this study is this is what updated our recent guidelines in NCCN and the risk factors. And so they were able to calculate the risk every 10 years of life for developing advanced gastric cancer. So this is not your T1A, intramucosal signet ring cell cancer that you find just on random biopsies. These are cancers that we know are going to progress, because those precancerous signet ring cell lesions we know we will find in almost 100% of patients if we remove their stomachs. But the question is, how many of those actually progress into meaningful cancers that will potentially put the patient's life at risk? And so these are all T1B and more advanced gastric cancers. And while the hazard ratios look scary for a 30-year-old with 34% times greater risk of developing a gastric cancer, when you look at the cumulative risk, lifetime risk, for men it only comes down to 10.3% risk, lifetime risk of developing a T1B or more advanced gastric cancer, and for women only 6.5%. So historically, when thinking about CDH1, we would talk to patients about up to 80% risk of developing gastric cancer or more, and so we would remove all of their stomachs. Well, really that risk of developing a impactful gastric cancer, not just an intramucosal lesion that will never advance, is in the 6 to 10% range. And we can see that this also impacts or demonstrates or reflects the family history, thinking about the pedigree and the importance. So individuals with an unknown family history or no family history of affected relatives with gastric cancer have around a 10% lifetime risk. And then if you have 3 family members or more with gastric cancer, that goes up to around 40% risk. So this study, significantly will inform our counseling for patients. And because of this, NCCN has updated their prevalence rates in the most recent guidelines, and now has a whole section. This is the first time that any hereditary gastric cancer is being considered in NCCN guidelines, but they now have a whole section providing insights, pros and cons for risk-reducing total gastrectomy versus endoscopic surveillance. A lot of this is reflected in another study by the NCCI published late 2023. Jeremy Davis, surgical oncology at NCI, is the one who did all of these surgeries consecutively, but 126 consecutive patients who underwent risk-reducing total gastrectomy. And you can see the rates of complications. So thinking about, how do we think about pros and cons for these patients? They have a 10% lifetime risk of developing cancer. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And you think about a 6% reoperation rate, a 7% readmission rate, a 6% anastomotic leak rate, primarily managed with endoscopic stents, duodenal stump blowouts of almost 3%, which is a significant complication. 9% of individuals required surgical feeding tubes to be placed because of malnutrition, because of other complications, failure to thrive, and incisional hernia rates in 11%. So very high rates of surgical complications. We would say that this is expected for such a significant surgery. But then you think about the long-term impact on patients. And at 2 years, 94% of patients exhibited chronic complications from their surgery, whether it's bile reflux, dysphagia. 25% of individuals changed jobs simply because of their insurance or because of complications with surgery symptoms they were having that prohibited them from continuing at their current job. And then dumping syndrome, which we know happens. And so at the end of the day, these studies out of the NCI give us a lot more information to have that patient-centered decision-making discussion with them about the risk benefits of risk reduction versus endoscopic surveillance. You can see they did look at the FACT subscales for quality of life, and that at 2 years, the subscales did not significantly differ compared to the preoperative baseline. So overall quality of life, there are varying, depending on what study you look at, whether or not there is buyer's remorse if patients regret undergoing a total gastrectomy or not afterwards. But the IGCLC, again, talking about a multi-day conference just talking about CDH1 mutations, they met in 2024 in Portugal. They have updates pending. These are some of the prelim findings. We're waiting for the final consensus to be published. But really, the management and prevention of hereditary diffuse gastric cancer is really up to the patient's choice. And now we have more information, better information to help guide that decision. So thanks so much for your time.